Russian President Vladimir Putin says fundamental transformations have taken shape in the world and that they are irreversible. The leader made the remarks at the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation Summit in Uzbekistan. Mr. Putin also slammed what he called the economic selfishness of the West at the gathering, attended by China, Iran and several Central Asian nations. He criticised the US and its allies for their use of sanctions to achieve political goals at the expense of the rising global challenges. He added that Moscow would be willing to hand over Russian fertilizer to developing nations free of charge. That is, if sanctions on its economy were lifted.
Яркий пример этого эгоизма – решение Еврокомиссии о снятии санкций с российских удобрений. Мы знаем, насколько важны удобрения для решения продовольственной проблемы. Само решение о снятии санкций мы, конечно, приветствуем. Но оказывается, что эти санкции в соответствии с разъяснением Еврокомиссии от 10 сентября этого года сняты только для стран-членов Евросоюза. Оказывается, только они могут приобретать наши удобрения. А как же развивающиеся, беднейшие страны мира?
Rosie Burchard joins us live from the summit in Samarkand. Rosie, we heard some strong words there from Mr. Putin on what he called the new centers of power. Can you just tell us a bit more about the Russian leader's stance at the SCO?
Well, perhaps unsurprising that Russian President Vladimir Putin had harsh criticism for the European Union and the United States. These are two sides really that are engaged with Russia in an economic standoff. The European Union, the US and their allies have sanctioned Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine, sanctioned energy supplies, sanctioned members of the Russian government. And now Moscow is accusing those sides of selfishness. It's reiterated these accusations which have been laid out before, that sanctions are preventing Russia from exporting fertilizers, particularly to developing countries. Now, I've spoken to some EU officials in the last few hours and they strongly refute these accusations. They say that Russia is free to export what it wants, that there are no sanctions when it comes to fertilizers and food. But of course, this is something which the Russian president is refuting in turn. So this standoff really just appears to be deepening. Now, the Russian president also, as you mentioned, hailed this growing influence of new centers of power, which he says are working together. And of course, that is what many analysts say, that this historic city of Samarkand, where I am, is bearing witness to an attempt to try and tilt the global balance of power away from the West. But Russian President Vladimir Putin was not the only person to address this summit. We also heard from the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, who argued that member states of the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation should crack down hard on terrorism, extremism and separatism. We also heard from the Turkish President Erdogan, who spoke directly about Russia's war in Ukraine and said Turkey wants that war to end as soon as possible. And the conflict is, in some ways, casting its shadow over these talks. These leaders, of course, woke up to those reports from Ukraine of the discovery of mass burials. And that, I think, just really puts in focus the tightrope that some of these leaders are trying to walk here, particularly the Turkish leader, the Indian leader, as they tried to keep up good and friendly relations both with Moscow and with the West.
Now, Rosie, apart from, all that talk on politics, what is it we're hearing as well about plans to create a climate council within the SCO?
Well, the SCO, we've heard from the Uzbek president who was hosting these talks that there is plan to adopt a document or a declaration on climate change. And also he's proposing that the SCO sets up a climate council. And this was really seemed very pertinent to this particular discussion because, as I said, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping were not the only ones addressing this summit. We also heard from the Pakistani Prime Minister, Shehbaz Sharif, and it really struck me. I mean, he was almost moved to tears as he talked about the ravages of these floods and extreme weather conditions we've seen in Pakistan over the last few weeks. He said it explicitly, these are clearly caused by climate change. So the SCO trying to increase cooperation on that front. It's likely something that will be welcomed to a certain degree by climate campaigners, but it won't likely be enough to satisfy them. Let's not forget that some of the people at this summit are representing countries which are major consumers of energy, China, for example. And meanwhile, Russia, of course, Russia's economy is almost entirely based on the export of fossil fuels.
Thanks very much, Rosie Birchard. They're reporting to us live from Samarkand, Uzbekistan.
A Chinese President Xi Jinping earlier called on members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation to rally together and support each other's security and development needs, which he termed as every country's core interests. He hailed the group's enduring friendship and peace, stressing its importance in a world he described as no longer a peaceful place.
当前世界100年未有之大变局正在加速演进。世界进入新的动荡变革期，我们要把握时代潮流，加强团结合作，推动构建更加紧密的上海合作组织命运共同体。
Mr. Xi added that all countries should work on preventing foreign forces from instigating so-called color revolutions. He announced Beijing will train some 2,000 law enforcement personnel from member states over the next 5 years to beef up the region's anti-terrorism efforts. He also invited them to sign up to China's Global Security Initiative, a grouping he proposed in April this year, and extended more than $200 million worth of grain and other emergency aid to developing countries. CNA's Olivia Seong in Beijing has more on the significance of President Xi's speech.
We could look at these remarks by President Xi as China looking to position itself as a global leader and also serving as a counter to what it sees as Western influence. Now, no specific countries had been named here, but certainly we can look at this as a veiled swipe at the US and the West as well, which China is increasingly seen as trying to band together and rally together to try and contain its rise. China also blaming the US and the West for the tensions that it's facing on the international stage as well. And Mr. Xi, we have to note, has chosen Central Asia as his first overseas trip destination in more than 2 years since this pandemic began. And at the SCO meeting, notably absent is the US and the West. And observers say that this has been taken as an opportunity for China to show up support among countries that are more friendly towards it, and for the organization to serve as a counterweight to other Western-led organizations as well. Now, all this comes at an incredibly politically sensitive time for Mr. Xi ahead of that key twice-a-decade Communist Party Congress that's to take place next month here in Beijing, where he is expected to be granted an unprecedented third term in power. So this show of global influence and his leadership on the world stage extremely key to show his leadership ahead of that meeting.
Well, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi also attending the summit in person, where he is due to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin on the sidelines later. Now, he has called for the group to try and create a resilient supply chain in the region, saying the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine have created hurdles in the global supply chain, resulting in the current food and energy security crises. Now, Ishan Garg, he joins us live now from New Delhi. Ishan, how do you think Mr. Modi will balance India's close ties with Russia amid all that Western pressure over the war in Ukraine when he meets with Putin later?
Well, this has been a concern for Mr. Modi from the time when Russia invaded Ukraine. This has been a concern for Mr. Modi since India started upping its import of Russian oil, eventually making Russia one of its biggest suppliers of oil. And constantly there has been criticism of India, but there's also been an understanding among its key allies like the US, Japan, Australia, and other Asian nations of the economic realities of India. Indian ministers have said in the past that India needs to rely on Russia because the ties go back nearly 7 decades since India's independence. And it's not just the energy reliance, it's also the fact that Russia is India's biggest arms supplier. And we have seen in the past few months that there is a growing understanding of this with countries like United States, the United Kingdom, making concerted efforts to wean India off of Russian arms supply and off of Russian fuel supply. But what's going to be of concern to India during the SCO particularly is going to be the optics. Mr. Modi is going to be in the company of President Vladimir Putin and President Xi Jinping, who have very openly criticized Western countries in the past. It's going to be a tightrope walk once again for Prime Minister Narendra Modi because he wants to maintain very close ties with the US. The US also, analysts say, not trying to be very hard on India because it needs New Delhi as a counterbalancing power, perhaps, against China. That's what analysts are saying. So that's likely, that equation is likely to make Mr. Modi's job easier when he tries to have close relationship with Russia as well as with the West.
Well, meantime, Irshan, are we seeing signs of perhaps a thaw in India's relations with China? And we're also wondering if Mr. Modi will actually be meeting Chinese leader Xi Jinping at the summit.
There's actually no confirmation yet on if Mr. Modi is meeting with Xi Jinping. This is a meeting that has been highly anticipated. There are various rumors about it, but it's unconfirmed as of now. But as of talking about the thaw in the relationship, there certainly seems to be signs of it. China has very clearly welcomed India's chairmanship of the SCO next year, saying that China will support India's agenda when India takes share of the SCO next year. Very recently, we have also seen a thawing in the border tensions between the two countries, with the armies of the two nations agreeing to disengage at a very crucial point in the Himalayan border at the Gogra hot springs. So there have been very crucial steps being taken to make sure that the border tensions between the two countries are de-escalated. And we have also seen the rhetoric of within Indian media and the Chinese media also coming down a little. The tone has been softened yet. So it would be fair to say that there has been a thaw in this relationship, but analysts say that it might take a direct political dialogue between Prime Minister Modi and his Chinese counterpart to make sure the relationship goes back to normal once again.
Many thanks for that report. Ishan Garg, reporting to us live from New Delhi.